Unit 1, Lesson 2, The Enlightenment. Unit 1, Lesson 2, Vocabulary. So before the Enlightenment took hold of Europe, the Renaissance and the Scientific Revolution occurred. What was the Renaissance exactly? What was that period, the golden age of arts and literature in Western Europe? And it was a rebirth of classical learning. And the scientific revolution we covered yesterday was where scientists began to question traditional beliefs and values, and it helped proliferate the use of logic and reason and observation and experimentation in seeking the truth. So the Enlightenment was also known as the Age of Reason, and it grew out of the scientific revolution of the 1500s and 1600s. If scientists could understand the physical world using reason, then reason could also be used to discover natural laws which shape the human experience. Remembering from our vocabulary that a natural law is an unchanged principle discovered through reason that governs all human contact or all human conduct. Enlightened thinkers, called philosophes, were concerned with the relationship between government and the people. Their ideas were used by many modern nations in the creation of governments. Using methods of modern science and reason, reformers set out to study human behavior and solve the political, social, and economic problems of society. This resulted in a move away from absolutionism and divine right, favored by many religions, toward democracy and individual rights. This encouraged the revolutionary leaders throughout Europe and the Americas to experiment with different forms of government. One such Enlightenment thinker was Thomas Hobbes. He wrote about his ideas in the work The Leviathan. Hobbes argued that people are naturally cruel, greedy, and selfish. As a result, government, or the law specifically, is there to protect people from each other. He believed that rulers should have absolute power because society was too cruel to have power itself, and that without government, people would fight, rob, and oppress one another. So Hobbes, an Enlightenment thinker, thought that men and the natural state of man is to be governed by one supreme power, like a monarch or king, because men were too greedy and selfish and cruel to have power over each other. John Locke, on the other hand, was an Enlightenment thinker that believed people are basically moral and reasonable, that they want to do the right thing. He believed that all people are born free and equal with three natural rights. Those rights were life, liberty, and property. John Locke believed that a government exists at the consent of the governed, or people, to protect their rights, and that if a government fails to protect these rights, then their contract between the government and the people is broken, and the people may change or replace that government. His most famous works, the Two Treaty of Government, stressed that the best governments had limited power and were not absolute monarchies. Another Enlightenment thinker that favored John Locke and not Hobbes was Montesquieu. He was a harsh critic of absolute monarchies and came to admire Great Britain's limited monarchy and said it protected people's rights. Montesquieu believed that having three branches in government would prevent tyranny because having a separation of powers would prevent any one branch from gaining too much power over the other two. Montesquieu was quoted as saying that in order to have liberty, it is necessary that government be set up so that one man need not be afraid of another man. Montesquieu's thoughts on the separation of powers believed government should be split into these three specific branches, and that each branch should be able to serve as a check on the other two. It's the executive branch, which enforces the laws, a legislative branch, which makes the laws, and a judicial branch, which applies the laws. One such country that adopted many of Montesquieu's ideas, especially the idea of a separation of powers, was the United States, with our three-branch system: the executive and the president, the judicial branch and the Supreme Court, and the legislative branch and the House of Congress, both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Another such thinker who had tremendous respect for individual freedoms and liberties was Voltaire. He believed in the freedom of press and used it to expose the abuses of corrupt political and church leaders throughout his era. He fought for civil liberties, for rights and freedoms of citizens. Among them were the freedom of speech and the freedom of religion, and fought to separate the church and the state. Voltaire believed that humanity's worst enemies were intolerance, prejudice, and superstition. His writings angered government and church officials alike, and he was imprisoned and forced into exile. To stop his ideas from spreading, his books and writings were outlawed and burned. Another Enlightenment thinker, Pierre Diderot, was a writer who was best known for his creation, the Encyclopedia. This was first published between 1751 and 1772. The purpose of the encyclopedia, according to Diderot, was to change the general way of thinking, to praise freedom and urge education to all. Diderot pushed the boundaries of accepted speech in the 18th century, and slavery was not an exception. He openly declared his disapproval of slaves and forced occupations, which caused some sections of the encyclopedia itself to be censored by the government. Another one of our Enlightenment thinkers, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, believed that people were naturally good, but were corrupted by society, and that an unequal distribution of property was an especially great evil of society. He stressed the importance of the general will, the will of all the people as a whole, and not focusing on individuals. He believed that the good of the community should be placed above individual interests, so more of the common good for all instead of individual goods. Jean-Jacques Rousseau hated all forms of political and economic oppression, especially those put in place by monarchs and the church. Rousseau wrote about his theories in the work called The Social Contract. This presented ideas of government and society. The thought was that society places too many limits on individuals' behavior, and that controls are somewhat necessary but should be minimal and not overreaching. Only governments that had been freely elected should create and impose law because the individuals were freely elected from the population. Rousseau believed that sovereignty, or the power to make laws, should be in the hands of the people. Therefore, the only good government, he thought, was a direct democracy, where the individuals were chosen from the population to represent the population directly. The Enlightenment was not as enlightening for women as it was for men, since natural rights were extended for men only. Though some enlightened thinkers said that women had natural rights, they were primarily limited to the areas of home and family. Some women, though, were exposed to enlightened philosophy through salons. Salons allowed Enlightenment ideas to spread. So these were hosted primarily by women, a social gathering where women were allowed not only to attend, but to learn about the Enlightenment ideas and the scientific revolutions, the changes in medicine and philosophy and mathematics. Women were allowed to attend these meetings and help learn what was going on in the world around them. One such woman was Mary Wollstonecraft, an Enlightenment thinker in the 1700s who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, in which she identified two problems with the views of many of the Enlightenment thinkers. First, she noted that the same people who argue that women must obey men are upset at the thought of being controlled by a monarch, by their king. Wollstonecraft pointed out that the power of men over women was equally as wrong as the power of a king over other men. Next, she argued that the Enlightenment was based on an ideal of reason in all human beings. Therefore, if women have reason, they are entitled to the same rights as men. That women would need education and be able to participate equally and fully in public life. So the spread of enlightenment happens throughout most of Europe. Before absolute monarchs ruled by divine right, the church had near unbreakable authority. There was a strict separation between nobles and rich merchant classes and the peasants. Those who suffered in life were thought to have possibly been rewarded in heaven. And that was a salvation for people who were of a lower class, of the peasant class, of the worker class, that they may be suffering in this earthbound life, but they would be rewarded in heaven. After the spread of the Enlightenment, after the scientific revolution, the thoughts were that the government should work to protect the people and that there's a certain flexibility in social classes because all people have innate natural rights, that all people have the pursuit of life, liberty, and property, and that we should seek a belief in happiness on earth where we're at now and not wait for the afterlife. We're not striving for something beyond what we have now. Now, of course, not everybody was on board with the Enlightenment, just like not everybody was on board with the scientific revolution. Typically, those who were not on board with either the scientific revolution or the Enlightenment were those who were set to or were going to be losing power by the average citizen and by other people becoming more knowledgeable of what's happening around them. So, government and church authorities felt that they had a sacred duty to defend the old order that had been established by God. So they waged a war of censorship. They burned books and imprisoned or exiled enlightened thinkers. Even with all that was happening, enlightened thinkers still found ways for their messages to be heard. Many disguised their ideas in works of fiction. So, despite the attempts of the old order, the enlightened thought continued to spread. Once that flame was lit, it continued to be spread throughout Europe and eventually throughout the world.